have other things to do, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, how do you, a lot of the time when we're learning like minutiae of things, or like very like intricate details, and it's very hard to like connect that to idea that Hashem is involved in everything, the sense of like scale and constant meaning in everything that we do. It feels easy to lose sight of that when you're in the more and when you're dealing with something like very fine and like on the face of it, like irrelevant. It only comes to matter once you put it into Heshbon.
Yeah,
How do you not lose track of like the significance of everything, every single thing you do, and
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I've talked about this before. You know, let's imagine you're a newcomer to Judaism. You're a recent Baal Tshuva, and you come to yeshiva because you want to understand the meaning of life, the purpose of existence. Why am I here? And you were told that the Talmud, contains all of the answers to these questions. So you show up to your first Gemara shir, and you're so excited. You're going to open this book, and the secrets of the universe are going to be revealed to you. Why? Why am I here? What is my soul? What is the essence of my existence? And you immediately get into a discussion about two people who walk into a Beis Din holding onto a talis, or an egg that was laid on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Are you allowed to eat the egg? And if you have a legal mind, you'll find it interesting. If you don't have a kind of a legal mind, you won't even find it that interesting. So that's one thing or the other. But either way, whether you enjoy it or whether you don't enjoy it, you don't immediately see how it connects to a greater world of spirituality. How do I understand my essence through this type of very technical learning? And it's a real problem, because if anything, the learning of a yeshiva, in some ways, is closer to a law school education than it is to what you might call a theological seminary. If you go, lahavdil, a gazillion havdalas, if you go into a Catholic seminary, you would be discussing the whole day, the nature of God. Of course, the ideas are false, but lemaisa, what you would be discussing is the nature of God and good and evil. And here, we're going over like legal problems of a different sort. So, indeed, therefore, this was a real problem, meaning to say, we make such a big deal about learning Torah, such a big deal about study of Torah. And in the yeshiva world, Talmud is emphasized as like the highest level. And yet we don't always see the immediate spirituality. So the truth is, this is really addressed. This is really the subject matter of the 4th chapter of the Nefesh HaChaim. The Nefesh HaChaim is Rav Chaim of Volozhin's famous work on Jewish theology. And although there are many other things in the work that people never get to, such as davening and mitzvahs, but in the yeshiva world, the 4th gate is considered to be the most famous and well-known part of Nefesh HaChaim, and it's devoted to the idea of what is special about Torah study. And in more than 30 chapters, he goes over the idea that the Torah is the will of God, and because God is an indivisible unity, when you connect to any part of God, there's no such thing as a part. You're automatically connecting to God, and therefore it makes no difference if you're studying something that's a spiritual topic or you're studying something that's a mundane topic. You are connected to God. Your neshama is plugged into a power source. So to explain rationally how Shnayim Mochsin B'talis is going to make me a better person, perhaps we can't explain it. But in truth, it will, because it connects you to pure godliness. And when you're connected to godliness, your neshama changes. Now, I've mentioned a number of times that the historical context of Nefesh HaChaim, although it's written in a very kind and gentle tone, is actually a polemic against the Hasidic movement. The Vilna Gaon was very militant against Hasidus. The Vilna Gaon put it in Cherem, and the Vilna Gaon, wanted to excommunicate. Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who was the Vilna Gaon's greatest Talmud, had a very different behavioral attitude towards Hasidim. He welcomed them, he was nice to them. There were Hasidic students in his yeshiva. Rumor has it that his son, Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhin, had Hasidic Svarim that he would learn. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe claims, although I'm not sure you can prove this, that Rav Chaim Volozhiner actually read Tanya and borrowed some things of the Nefesh HaChaim from the Tanya that was printed first. Who knows? Although there is no question that there's a lot of commonality between them. But in spite of his gentle tone, his kind tone, his non-critical tone, it is a polemic against Hasidus in the following way. Hasidus tried to emphasize this is early Hasidus, the inner spiritual dimension of things, that the most important thing of a mitzvah is not doing the mitzvah necessarily, but it's the devekus, the love of God, the reverence of God, the cleaving of your neshama to God. And as a result, if you can't really do a mitzvah with those kavanas, your mitzvah is not worth very much. And they applied the same paradigm to the learning of Torah. When you learn Torah, you consciously have to strive to connect your soul to God. And if not, you're just a rabbinic lawyer or whatever it is, and your learning doesn't amount to very much. Rav Chaim Volozhiner very strongly attacks that position. He basically says it is the Maisa HaMitzvah itself that connects you to Hashem. Kavanos are very good. They're desirable. They bring you to the next level. But if you had to choose between Maisa without Kavana and Kavana without Maisa, the Maisa is the Ikar. And he also claims that in learning Torah, it connects you to God, but it shouldn't be part of your self-conscious process. You shouldn't be thinking about how this connects me to God. Because his argument is, if you spend too much time thinking about how this connects me to God, you will never get engrossed in the technicalities of the sugya that in fact will bring you closer to God. Because you're learning a Tosfos, you're learning a Rebbe Kiva Eger, you're learning some complicated thing. If you stop in the middle and say, how is this making me a better person? You'll lose patience. So he says it's kind of an idea where you have to let the Torah carry you. You have to let the Torah move you. You have to just integrate it. When you're learning Torah, he says, you're not focusing on God. You're not focusing on something higher. You're focusing on your understanding the Torah itself. And by entering into the understanding of the Torah, it will connect you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, he does say the following. He has a very interesting point. He says that Torah Lishma does not mean I'm learning Torah for the sake of God, as we often think. Torah Lishma means I'm learning Torah for the sake of Torah, to understand Torah. But he said that the Gemara in Vav Metzia says that when I sell you grain, right, you buy grain, you buy a ton of grain, so a certain percentage of that is allowed to be dirt and rocks because the soil preserves the grain a little bit. In other words, you sometimes need soil or debris to preserve the grain. And the measurement based on the Mishnah is 1/24. So whatever it would be, you buy, okay, let's make it simple. You buy 24 pounds of grain, so 1 pound of it can be rocks and dirt. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner suggests you should apply the same paradigm to your learning, that you need Yiras Hashem to preserve your Torah. So Yiras Hashem is not the grain. The Torah is the grain. The Yiras Hashem is the preservative. He therefore comes up with the formula that 1/24 of your learning time, you should stop and reflect on God and how this connects you to God. Now it's interesting. I'm thinking to myself that if you assume, at least in the Volozhiner Yeshiva, a 12-hour learning day, although our day is shorter, then 1/24 is a half an hour. That might be the source of why in the yeshiva world it was traditional that you had a half an hour Musar Seder. Because the Musar is where you focused on your connection to God in a very direct way, and 30 minutes is 1/24 of 12 hours. So I'm just wondering if that might have been the source. So it's very hard. I mean, my short answer to you is, it is very hard to demonstrate this on a purely rational basis. It is a metaphysical, mystical idea based on the unification of your mind and your soul to the will of Hashem. And because Hashem is an undifferentiated entity, the will of God is coextensive with the essence of God. And when I connect myself to God, my neshama is connected to its source, it gets elevated, it gets transformed, And therefore, it almost makes no difference what you're learning. You don't have to learn overtly spiritual things. This is the Shar Dalet of the Nefesh Chaim. In fact, I'm told, this is a very funny thing, that Rav Chaim was against spending too much time on Musar and too much time on mysticism. He felt it was the guts of these halachic discussions that bring you to God. I'm told that the Nefesh Chaim was not even learned in the Volozhiner Yeshiva because it was a Musar Sefer, and the Nefesh Chaim says not to learn Musar, okay, whatever it would be. But ad kedei kach, that is as far as they went. Yeah.
Why? So why? Do you have any sense of why Hashem would set it up that way? Then why the transmission of his will comes through this very grounded, low-level legal detail?
So part of it is this. Part of it is the idea that God is in the details of life, meaning to say we could be very, very elevated and inspired by contemplating all sorts of high and spiritual ideas. But the Torah puts a certain role on us to translate the high and elevated spiritual into the mundane activities on earth. The concept is, the more mundane you go, the more profane you go. And to bring divinity into that, bring divinity into your business, bring divinity into your farming, bring divinity into your cooking, bring divinity into your bathroom habits. So even though on one level that looks like you're leaving the realm of holiness, it's actually a higher level of holiness in which you are uncovering the divine within the concealment. And that's why halachic Judaism is very detail obsessed. Right? We are obsessed with detail because we recognize that holiness in the abstract is the realm of the angels. Now, if God wanted holiness to be on that abstract level, then there was no reason why we should be created. Because if all we're going to do is be second-rate angels, God has first-rate angels. God doesn't need second-rate angels who are imperfect imitations of the real thing. So God has something unique in our role that angels cannot fulfill, and that is grappling with physicality, grappling with materialism, grappling with the mundane. Because the true sign of holiness is, can I bring my holiness into the mundane? And that is really ultimately what Talmud is about, at least the halachic. Of course, Talmud is Agadata. In Agadata we have everything else, for sure. But at least the halachic discussions are about bringing holiness into the mundane, that God is in the details. It's reminiscent, I have mentioned this before, of a humorous story involving Leo Tolstoy, the great author of War and Peace. Now, Tolstoy was a member of the Russian aristocracy. He was Count Leo Tolstoy, before the Russian Revolution, during Tsar. And he was relatively wealthy, and he owned serfs. He owned slaves. Serfs were the Russian slavery. Now, he was also somewhat of a social reformer, and he wrote pamphlets about rights of man, even anti-smoking, whatever it is. And one of his pamphlets called for the abolition of serfdom, that, you're violating the rights of man by enslaving them. So someone called him on it and said, hey, Count Tolstoy, you're against slavery, you consider it to be immoral, you consider it to be a violation of the rights of humankind. You have serfs and you don't treat them particularly well. What's going on? So Tolstoy is said to have remarked, just because I'm a lover of humanity doesn't mean I have to be nice to people. Meaning, I'm committed to a cause, a global cause. But when it comes to the particulars of my life, he was saying it, I think, self-reflexively, he understood. He says that the broad general concepts don't always translate into the here and now. People talk about kindness and love, but they don't necessarily get along with their spouses, their children, their next-door neighbors, right? They're committed to global love. Now, Judaism works the other way. Judaism says that the real test of the sincerity of your spiritual aspirations is whether they can be brought down to the micro-granular level. of one-to-one interactions or small interactions and the like. So there's a lot there to think about in terms of how this elevates you. Now, the one thing I can say is this. I'm not going to make the claim, because it wouldn't be true, that everybody who learns, is going to be better than people who don't learn. That's probably not emes. You might find people who don't learn who are better balei midos. But I think we can make the claim, although I can't prove it, that anyone who learns will be a better person than he would be if he wouldn't have learned. Now, again, you can ask me, how do I know that? I'm not sure I can prove it. But that might be the case, right? That the Torah does change you, it does elevate you. The person who spends his hours learning Bava Mitzvah, is learning something that will help him be a better parent, a better husband, a kinder person. But I will add one condition: that's only if that's part of your motivation in your learning. Meaning you don't think about it necessarily, but you think, I'm learning because I want to become close to God. That's where the 1/24th comes in. That 1/24th of your time, you should be thinking about how this spiritualizes me. But don't think about it the rest of the time, because then you'll lose patience with the intricacies of a sugya. Because if everything has to be geared towards that higher goal, you're not going to have the patience, because you're not going to be able to see how every detail brings you to that higher goal. So it's a complicated process. It's not a simple process. But the Torah is designed to transform us in various ways. Yeah.
This is a two-part question about common mistakes I think I see at the Shabbos table or the Yom table regarding brachas, and I'm wondering if one is chayav in a new bracha, if such a thing happens. The first case is when everyone is washed and the ball will make hamotzi, and then everyone has to be totally quiet until they eat. Sometimes people will hum after the hamotzi, or talk out about the bread, like pass the bread, pass the salt, something related to the bread, but you're still talking between the bracha and the eating. That's the first case. Second case is again when the ball is going to be yotze and either kiddush or hamotzi, and someone will say amen too early. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, amen, and then the final consonant will come. I heard somebody say, you might not be yotze, but you have a situation, would one be chayav in a bracha in these two cases?
Yeah. So the first case, when people, so humming, there was a question, is humming considered a hefsek? But l'maisa b'diavad, we paskin it's not. So as long as I didn't talk, I'm humming along, so all right, so we're going to be, at least b'diavad, we're going to be makel on that, although it's better actually not to do that. Now in terms of speaking, like pass the bread, pass the salt, so it really depends exactly what your question is. Are you referring to between washing and hamotzi, or are you referring to after the hamotzi?
After the hamotzi.
Okay. Between washing and hamotzi, it's a davar pashut ma'od. The Gemara says beferish that although you're not supposed to talk between washing your hands and the hamotzi, but anything that's connected to bringing the food to the table is permitted. So I am allowed to say beferish, bring the salt. That's an actual example in the Gemara itself. Bring the knife, whatever it is. So that's not a problem. Now, your case is a little worse, because that's not just an interruption between washing and hamotzi. There you're dealing with an interruption between the hamotzi and the actual eating of the bread, and that normally is a stricter rule, that you can't have a hefsek between the bracha and the eating of the food. Here too, b'diavad, however, you would not, as long as what you said pertained to the meal. It wasn't just, hey, how about those Yankees or whatever it is. It was something that pertained to the meal. So in a case like that, b'diavad, you would not have to repeat. Now, in terms of saying the amen early, that is a very, very serious. That's a very, very serious problem. Amen before a bracha is finished is not a valid amen. So you really have two questions. It's not a valid amen. So number one, I didn't answer amen. So if I didn't answer amen, can I be yotze with hamotzi? I didn't answer a valid amen. On that, the answer is b'diavad, even if you didn't answer amen, as long as you had kavanah to be yotze, right? Now, the other question is, I made a hefsek between the bracha and the eating. So that would be the same answer as before. You did it erroneously, thinking it was part of the meal. So once again, I think both aspects of the question would have the same answer, that b'diavad, you would not have to repeat a bracha.
Something happened interesting at the Seder, which was, someone was trying to be helpful but didn't really know the halachas very well, and we said, everyone said, "Bereit for gafen," and they said, to be drunk and sitting in the left while eating, and then spoke out the halachas and then drank. It sounds like but he was talking about the drinking.
B'diavad. Yeah, when I conduct a Seder, I also make the announcement, but always, of course, before the Bereit Gafen. Say, we're going to make a bracha, we lean to the left and drink the wine. Yeah, you certainly should not say it, l'chatchila, between the bracha and the drinking, but b'diavad, it's the tzarech, the drinking, so it's okay, yeah.
How should one view Jews with special needs, Down syndrome, autism, etc.? Is it a bad thing that they have special needs? Are they just as holy as a fully able Jew?
Yeah, this is a very, very interesting question. We do have, unfortunately, children or adults in difficult circumstances, with physical handicaps, mental handicaps, autism, all sorts of difficulties. And as a result, on one level, they're not able to do what other people do. They have levels of suffering that are much greater, perhaps, than most people. How do we view them? So the emes is, I'll be honest with you, you will find on the internet, this is not my position at all, but you will find on the internet some prominent speakers, let's say Rabbi Mizrahi, whatever it is, you'll find, who will actually say that this is divine punishment because in a prior reincarnation they did certain sins, so God is putting them through this awful misery, or their parents did improper things, so the kids were born this way. So there is indeed, I'm not going to deny it, because I try to be honest with you, there will be sources that will look at this as divine punishment for either prior incarnations or parental sin or the like. And therefore they see this as expressions of the wrath of God. Is that a possibility? I can't dismiss it as a possibility, but I do want to say there's another way of looking at it as well, which is very, very fascinating. It is recorded that the Chazon Ish, the great Chazon Ish, used to stand up before children who were very severely handicapped. Because his argument was that most of our souls come into the world in a great state of imperfection, and we have to repair them by Torah and mitzvahs. If a soul comes into the world and it's not able to fully do Torah and mitzvahs, that actually means the soul is a higher level of perfection than those who need to do the repair work. So there actually was an idea that certain levels of handicap may represent a certain spiritual greatness that is so elevated that it didn't need the perfection of Torah and mitzvahs. Now, of course, that does raise the obvious question, so why did God put that soul in the world at all? Meaning, if the soul is already perfect, if it doesn't need rectification, if it doesn't need to fix anything, then why is it here? Let it just be the pure soul in heaven. Well, once again, a lot of it is a mystery, but sometimes souls have a mission. And this is an amazing thing. Sometimes the mission of a soul is not what the soul will do, but what the soul will cause other people to do. This soul is here, so I become a kinder person. I become a better person. I become a more sensitive person. This neshama is here for the transformative effect it has on me. And that is how that neshama reaches the level it needs to reach. Not by what it does, by what it causes me, other people, to do in that particular way. So I would have to say this. I would have to say, if you ask me in the abstract, is the neshama as holy as every other person? The answer is yes, and maybe holier. Maybe even holier. But God has given it a different mission. And people do have different missions. And we don't always know why one soul is given this mission, one soul is given that mission. Special needs is one example of that, but you have countless examples. Why is one person born to a 5th generation or 10th generation Yerushalmi family in Mea Sharem, and another person is born in a farm in South Dakota, totally without connection to Judaism. Why is that? You know, is it that the South Dakota person was inferior, or the South Dakota person had a different task in life that required that journey in South Dakota? You see? It's not a question one is better than the other. They're different. They have different missions. Yeah, I don't have what that Mea Sharem person has. But that Mea Sharem person doesn't have what I have. Meaning, we have unique missions, which is why it's so important in your tshuva process that you don't put up as your goal to just be like somebody else, because then you're playing a catch-up game. And in a catch-up game, you'll never be successful. Meaning to say, you start coming to Torah when you're 25, and your goal is to be just like that person who was born from. Well, you got 25 years behind. You know, you're not gonna be that. But if you understand, there was a reason that God gave me 25 years without Yiddishkeit. And there's something I got from those years. And I got to figure out how to integrate that in my avodas Hashem. Then, what you're doing is you're not trying to be, like angels I said before, you're not trying to be an inferior imitation of somebody else. You're trying to be what you really are. And that's a very, very different point. You know, I've mentioned this maybe 100 times over the years, so forgive me if you heard it many times, but I remember Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel's Levaya. He was the great Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, and he had a very, very interesting story. I mean, he's from a religious family, a very chashuva family, so he's not a Baal Tshuva by any means. But on some level, he is kind of a Baal Tshuva. But I mean, he was born into a very frum family. But, you know, he grew up in Chicago. He went to a co-ed Jewish high school. He was on the basketball team. He was on the debating team. And then he came to Eretz Yisrael to learn in the Mir Yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva of whom was his great uncle, so he did come to a chashuva family. But he had never learned Gemara more than like an hour at a time. So the first time he has to learn 4 hours morning Seder, he's like totally out of it. And then he asks his chavrusa, after he's totally exhausted, 4 hours of learning, he asks him, so what do you guys do in the afternoon here? Like, you go out into Yulim? He says, well, no, we do it again. He says he couldn't believe it at all. So when he died, you know, he was ill for many years. He had multiple sclerosis, and he kept on going, a tremendous inspiration. And he died suddenly. He was very sick, but it was not expected at the time that he died. So I remember going to the Levaya, and all of the Hespedim made a single point, kind of the same point, and it says, you see what a man can become, even though he grew up in Tuma, he grew up in co-ed, and he grew up with basketball, and he grew up in America, and all that garbage in America. He was able to escape it. He was able to transcend it. He was able to go beyond it. That's the message. You're not locked in to that decadence and superficiality of American culture, even American Jewish culture. Now, here's the thing. I might get in trouble for this. Okay, that is a message. But it's not the only message here. Because those who knew the Rosh Yeshiva knew that it's not simply he escaped from his American past. He drew on it as the key to how he related to different people. Meaning to say, when American teenage kids from modern Orthodox co-ed schools would be visiting Israel, and they'd visit the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, and they'd look around, and Mir was a totally unfamiliar type of place for them. And they're sitting with this man with a long beard and a black coat. And they have no idea who he is. And he starts talking to them about jump shots and dating. And it blew their minds. But then they realized he understood their culture. He understood their milieu. They were able to connect to him. And they saw that even within that culture, you can still become a Talmid Chacham. And a Ben Torah. I hope I'm being clear here, meaning his approach was not to amputate that past and make believe it never existed, which some people do that. His approach was to acknowledge it And therefore, to me, the greatest inspiration of his life was not that he managed to repudiate where he came from, but the other way around. He remembered where he came from, and he used that in his avodas Hashem. It's not the tshuva of amputation. It's the tshuva of capturing and sublimating and using it to avodas Hashem. This is an important insight, because that means you draw on the totality of your life to build your relationship to God. Just as, for example, the alcoholic or the drug addict who goes beyond his addictions can become a drug counselor, in which it's the very fact of his addiction that gives him the insight and the empathy that he otherwise wouldn't have. So he's not just cutting off that past, he's using that past. We have to use our lives in avodas Hashem. You see? How did I get onto that? I don't even remember how I got onto this, but try to reconstruct it here.
Than another, it's just different backgrounds, different situations relating to Jews with special needs.
Yeah. So the point basically, I was just making the point that people are given different backgrounds. They're given different challenges. And the goal is not always to go beyond the challenges in the sense that make believe they don't exist, but to recognize that this is your life. And in the fullness of your life, you can find bracha and hatzlacha and simcha and success. So I think the special needs problem is maybe a variant of the fact that we all come from different backgrounds. Yeah.
Really, as a follow-up to that, with the past and trying to dig in to the past, and now I can call them Averas, didn't know what that was. What if speaking about the past just puts you in a bad place?
So it may depend, meaning to say the following. There may be times in your life where something was so toxic and something was so negative that you need to put a big distance between yourself and that past. Again, the analogy would be that sometimes a limb may be so gangrenous that you have to amputate it. Otherwise, it's going to kill you. But amputation is a last resort and not a first resort, meaning to say, at some point in your life, the higher level would be to kind of confront that past and see what you can get out of it. But yes, sometimes it's gangrenous. Sometimes you got to amputate it. So this is not necessarily a static, one answer fit all type of situation. I'll give you. There are even trivial examples. Okay, I don't know if you want to get into this. I read an interesting article. It was a kind of a modern Orthodox, interesting person, a modern Orthodox Hasidic Rebbe, kind of a combination of opposite things. He's a Chassid, he lives in Square Town, but he also was very conversant with popular culture. And he talked about the fact, I get in trouble with this, that there were many like Rosh Hashivas in Israel or America who grew up in, even if they're not Balei Tshuva technically, but they grew up in modern Orthodox homes. And they watched television growing up, whether it was I Love Lucy or Gilligan's Island, I don't know if you know any of these shows, or whatever it would be. And they filled themselves. TV in those days was actually much more innocent. A waste of time it always was. That much I'll say. Meaning I'm never going to make the claim that it was somehow some glorious intellectual, spiritual experience, for sure. But in the olden days, the big rap against TV was that it was a waste of time, which is a serious thing. Today it's much, much worse than a waste of time. Okay. So a lot of Rosh Hashivas, wasted their time on this stuff. And yet, it gave them a certain ability to relate. It gave them a sense of humor. It gave them a sense of whimsy. They could often draw analogies from popular culture to illustrate Torah ideas. So how do they look back at those hours, which they would never allow their kids to do? How do they look back at those hours of playing baseball or playing basketball or watching television or sneaking into movie theaters? on one hand, waste of time, wrong, bittul Torah, even then lack of tznius. On the other hand, there were certain things that it did give them, that they draw upon. It's a complicated question, right? That things that we might say are better not to do, but lamaisa, there are things you get. So when you lived a life, even if it was against Hashem, and Baruch Hashem, you've moved beyond it, and you're trying to align your life with God's will. But you still have to look at your past and see, what can I extract from it? And there may be some very, very important lessons that you have. How does one relate to one's parents? Let's say one's parents, are totally not religious. Let's say. So what do? I'm a Baal Tshuva. Do I start saying, I really can't talk to my parents because they don't understand? Or when I have children, I can't let them see their grandparents because their grandparents, go to the movies, whatever it will be. Or do I say this? Do I say, my parents didn't teach me about Shabbos and kosher, but my parents taught me about being honest, about being nice to people, about, not speaking Lashon Hara. They didn't call it that, but whatever it would be. As I say, this notion that because they weren't from, therefore, they're no good, is false thinking. It just isn't true. It isn't true. And you got to appreciate it. I've mentioned this before over the years. I know a fellow who grew up in Falls Church, Virginia, totally assimilated house, totally assimilated. And after graduation, he took a trip to Israel, just a trip, and he became religious. But not only did he become religious, he became a chassid, a Hasidic Yid, with Yiddish speaking and this and that. And he got engaged to a woman who was also not religious, who became a Hasidic, woman. Very unusual, because this wasn't Chabad. So, other than Chabad Hasidim don't go out of their way to be Makarev people that much. And he was getting married in Mea Sharim. So I was invited to the wedding. So I was at the wedding, and I felt a little uncomfortable. I was a dark suit and hat, but still, it wasn't Chassid. This was hardcore Hasidim, speaking in Yiddish, It wasn't my place. But I still remember his father was shell-shocked. His father thought this was the Twilight Zone. He was wearing a string tie, from Texas. He had a big button on him, "Do not smoke in my presence," in front of everyone who's, smoking. And I think it was not just men and women were separated. There were different buildings. The women were in different buildings. And the guy just doesn't know. He's looking at his son that he had, seen 3 years before. And the son is, payas and beard and knee socks. And just, the person was totally, totally in shock. I really felt sorry for him. He did not know what hit him at all. So at the end of the chasna, they finally brought the kala back from the other building for Sheva Brachas. So the chassan gets up and he speaks in Yiddish a little bit, which is pretty amazing. And then he turns to his parents, and says in English, he says, Mom and Dad, he says, I know that I'm living a life that's very different than the life you imagined. But I want you to know that 90% of who I am is from you. And the 10% that's different is because you gave me the courage to find my own way in life. So everything I have, I'm grateful to you. This was an extraordinarily beautiful, moving moment. I remember I was sitting next to a Hasidic guy, and it seemed to me the Hasidic guy didn't understand English, but he was nodding away, because there was a sense, as Chazal say, Devar Hayatzim min halev, words that come out of the heart go into the heart. But maybe he was also some American guy, who knows? You never know what's going on here beneath the surface. But this is the attitude of the notion of looking at my past and understanding that there's some good things here. There's some good things here, and I got to reclaim it. I can't just have 20 or 30 years wasted, written off, zero. I got to see there was something positive there, and I have to try to reclaim that positivity. Yeah.
What constitutes as kol isha, and is avoiding kol isha halacha, chumrah, minhag?
Yeah.
And what's sort of the core for this?
Yeah. So I remember years ago when I was dating my Rebbetzin before we were even engaged. So we were in a restaurant in New York. It was a kosher Japanese restaurant, and they had a Japanese woman singing. So I was a little concerned. So I went over to the mashgiach, who was a frum guy with a long beard, and I said, there's kol isha here. So he looked at her and he said in Yiddish, he says, "Nicht ken kol, nicht ken isha." No voice, no woman. He said, no problem, whatever. He said, okay, but let me give you a little background. The Gemara in Maseches Brachos, it's a Gemara, uses the phrase, kol be'isha erva. The voice of a woman is like a nakedness. There is a nakedness. There's an erva in the voice of a woman. Now, there is a machlokes rishonim what that means. This is very important. According to some rishonim, it means that when you hear a woman singing, well, first of all, there's a machlokes. Is it speaking voice or singing voice? If it's speaking voice, we're really in trouble. Okay, I'm not even going to pursue that because the halacha is we're talking about a singing voice. Okay, so let's leave out the speaking chumrah. But within the singing voice, there's a huge machlokes rishonim. Some rishonim take the position that this is nothing more than a restriction on your heter to recite brachos and to learn Torah and to daven. I'm not allowed to recite a bracha. I'm not allowed to learn Torah verbally, and I'm not allowed to daven in the presence of hearing a woman sing, even my own wife. So according to that opinion would actually say, yeah, you want to go to an opera, listen to a woman, perfectly mutter. The only thing is you can't recite brachos because of the sexual, erotic nature of kol. So that is view number one that says kol isha is not a prohibition, bi'etzem. It is simply a limitation on your heter of amiras, devarim, shebikdusha, including Torah learning. There is a second view of kol isha, however, that says it is not only a restriction on Torah learning and davening and brachos, but it's actually an isser, not a minhag, it's actually an isser. It is forbidden for you to hear a woman singing. You understand, these are two very different definitions. Now, la halacha, we actually paskin both of them are true, and that's why the laws of kol isha are located in two different places in the Shulchan Aruch. In Hilchos Kriya Shema, we have the rule that I'm not allowed to recite brachos or learn Torah or daven or say Shema in the presence of a woman singing, and that applies even to my wife. Even to my wife. I cannot daven while she's singing. Now, that's in Orach Chaim. In Even HaEzer, we have the general prohibition. It is forbidden to listen to a woman singing because it may stimulate erotic thought. But for that isser, it is mutter if it's your wife, if it's your daughter, and some would say if it's your sister, you see, or it's your mother or grandmother. You see, two different halachas. The halacha of Devarim Shebikdusha is absolute, right? Even if it's your mother, even if it's your daughter, even if it's your wife. That's why Zemiras could theoretically be a problem. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about that. But the isser of listening when you're not saying a bracha, that does not apply to your wife. Some are machmer when your wife is a nida. Some are mekel, even for that. But when your wife is not a nida, for sure it's mutter. To my daughter, to my sister, that's going to be a machlokas and the like. But see, these are two different halachas. One is the Orach Chaim Dika law. The other is the Even HaEzer Dika law. So, those who think you're allowed to go to an opera are connected to Shulchan Aruch, but they actually have a view to rely upon. They're relying on the Rishonim who say Kol Isha is only an isser of Devarim Shebikdusha. Okay, but the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah do not paskin that way. So, given all of that, given the halacha that Kol Isha has two different aspects, so there are a lot of questions. Number one, what age does it start from? Because obviously I'm allowed to hear a 3-year-old sing a song or whatever it is. So there are different machlokim about this. Some say it may only start around 11, when a girl begins to mature. Some say 7 or 8. There are going to be different views about that. But the most common kol isha problems are when you're dealing with other than live music, meaning live singing for sure is asur. The question becomes, what about something recorded? So here, every single issue is a machlokas, meaning there's nothing that is absolutely going to be asur like everybody or mutter like everybody. But a very common heter is to listen to a recorded musical performance if you don't know what the singer looks like. They say, I don't want to say that I know this is true because I don't know that it's true, but they say Rav Yosef, and I mentioned this morning, he was a Rav in Egypt in his young years. So there was apparently a very famous Egyptian Arabic singer, a woman that he liked very much, but he never knew what she looked like. He had never seen a photograph of her. And they say, again, I can't say I know for sure, they say he used to listen to her records because he said the isser of kol isha is the stimulation of erotic thought, but the erotic thoughts come in only if you can visualize the actual person. So that's one heter, recorded music when you don't know what the person looks like. Okay, that's probably, although not everybody accepts it, but that's probably, if there is a heter, that's the most accepted heter. And then there are some who will even be more lenient. They will allow any recorded music, even if you see the performer, as long as it's a recording and it's not a live performance at the time you're viewing it. Right? So that's going to be a question that will be faced. So again, you have to ask a shaila about all of these different issues. But the one thing I can say is kol isha is not a minhag. It is a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that is based on the Gemara itself. Gemara in Brachos, kol beisha erva, but there is a big machlokas how it applies. A very interesting question that arises is AI and kol isha. With artificial intelligence, the AI stuff, you can actually create simulations based on composites and digital imagery of women singing, but there's no actual woman that's singing at all. It's not even a recording. A recording is at least a recording of a woman singing. This is a fake. This is like a robot. This is like creating an artificial woman. Is there an isser of kol isha in those types of voices that sound indistinguishable to that of a woman? It appears that it's not kol isha, it's not the voice of a woman. So it actually should be mutter. But then you get into another thing. If lamaisa it stimulates erotic thoughts, then that's a separate reason why you're not allowed to do it. Meaning even if it's not subjective, even if it's not objectively kol isha, if it has that effect on you, but that's an individual decision, you have to keep away from it. Okay, but technically it would not be kol isha. Yeah.
Would there be a difference between a woman singing solo versus in a choir with men?
Yeah, so that's another issue. There were those. The Gemara says in a few places that when multiple voices are singing, you don't really make it out so well. So some have allowed kol isha in either a mixed choir, or some have even allowed it if in a woman's only, if only the women, if more than one woman is singing. Now, the source of this is a very interesting tshuva by a very, very interesting man, very interesting rabbi, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. I'm not sure if I mentioned him before. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg is known as the Sridei Eish, which is his books of Shelos and Tshuvos. There is, in fact, a very excellent English biography of the Sridei Eish, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. He was an extraordinarily interesting gadol because he combined so many different things. On one hand, he was a Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka, very, very close to the Alter of Slobodka. He was a mentor, an older mentor to Rav Aaron Kotler and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Ruderman. They all of the later Gedolim, looked up to him. So he was a great Talmud Chacham and very close to the great Bali Musar, Alter Slobodka, and the other Bali Musar, Rav Itzel Petterberger, Rav Naftali Amsterdam, very, very close. On the other hand, he had very, very strong desires to broaden his horizons with the university education. Now again, today, maybe except in Israel, that's not such an uncommon combination. But in those days, it was extremely uncommon. If you were a Slobodka, a Litvasha, and a Litvasha yeshiva, to go to college would be like converting to Christianity. I mean, it was, you just don't do it. But he did it. He went to Berlin. Whether he got a PhD is open to question. Some say he never officially completed. We don't know. He was known as Rabbi Dr. Weinberg. All right, people investigate. Did he exactly get the doctorate? But he did have a university education. He became an instructor in the university. And eventually, he took over as the Rosh Yeshiva and Dean of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, which kind of tried to integrate Torah learning and academic Judaism under the same rubric. So he was quite a complicated person because he was trying to combine things that were very much opposite. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto for a while. Baruch Hashem, he miraculously was saved. After the war, he relocated to Switzerland, out of the way. And really was very, very strange because there were so many American places that wanted him, so many places in Israel that wanted him. And he was there kind of away from everybody. And he once said about himself that he's not at home anywhere. He says he could because he could have become a university professor or a Rosh Yeshiva. He said, I'm too frum for the universities, and I'm too liberal for the yeshiva world. So he felt he had no place to go. So he was in Switzerland. He wrote his Sefirah, published his Sefirah. There were some yeshivas in Switzerland. He was never a Rosh Yeshiva, but he would sometimes give guest shiurim there. The Sridei Eish, very, very fascinating person. So in the Sridei Eish, he writes the following. When he first came to Germany in the early 1930s, right before Hitler rose to power, he saw a lot of things in German Orthodoxy, that he had never seen in Poland and Lithuania. Never imagined it. And among them was a group that was very similar to what today would be called NCSY. And that is boys and girls, high school age, college age. They would sit together on Shabbos and they would sing Zemiros together. And this was an experience that brought them closer to Yiddishkeit, closer to Torah. Again, if any of you have ever been to NCSY, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And yet, he said, he was shocked. He was absolutely shocked. The notion that girls and boys would sit together and sing on Shabbos, in apparent violation of kol isha, in a religious home, this would absolutely never be done, except maybe father, daughter, brothers, maybe only in that configuration, meaning immediate family, but not outside of the immediate family. So at first glance, he said he was very put off. He thought this was another example of the German compromises with Orthodoxy. But then he realized how this was such a successful technique to bring people to Yiddishkeit and make them Balei Tshuva, that he very much looked for a heter, and he did identify heterim based on the fact that many voices are singing together, and therefore you're not really focusing. So that's the famous heter of the Sridei Eish, Trei Koli, two voices, Lo Mishtami. But again, I want to point out that these type of heterim are cumulative heterim, meaning to say, you can't just pick out the Trei Koli thing. You have to look at the overall context of Kiruv Rechokim, bringing people. There has to be all of that stuff. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was for a long time, when I used to live in Maryland, I was a posek or a rabbinic advisor to a pretty modern Orthodox co-ed school, and they wanted to put on a Broadway musical Les Miserables, so that's how you pronounce it. And they wanted women to sing. But they, listen, we'll just have, boys and girls, men and women, high school students, they'll sing together. And we'll rely on the Sridei Eish. But you understand that the notion of boys and girls singing Shabbos Semiros is a different contextual situation than simply, let's do a Broadway musical. So you can't automatically, this is where you got to be careful. You can't automatically take heterim that were given in a context of kiruv rechokim and apply it to pure entertainment. But there is, as I say, but there is such an idea of a mixed group. Yeah.
Here's another sentence. For the mitzvah each individual has to write a Sefer Torah, there's an opinion that one can fulfill this by buying Sepharim.
Yeah.
Is that halachically, and if so, what are the parameters? Which Sepharim? How many of them? If this is not a valid fulfillment of the mitzvah, what else can we do?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. The 613th mitzvah of the Torah, the very last one, according to the Rambam adds one after that, is that every Jew must write a Sefer Torah. Kisfu lachem es ashira hazos, write a Torah. Now, issue number one, even in the most literal sense that you have a chiyuv to write the Torah, it's understood you can make a shaliach to write. So if I had the money, I hire a sofer to write a Torah, for sure I'm yotzei, right? So no one says I got to write, right? It reminds me of the moel, technically a father has the chiyuv to circumcise his son, but he has to make the moel a shaliach. So have you ever seen this? Sometimes the moel will say to the father, it's your mitzvah, do you want to do it? I'll guide you if you want to do it. And most of the time, as far as I've seen, the father kind of said, no, it's okay, you can be my shaliach. So the same thing with Ksiva Sefer Torah, you can do it through a shaliach. Now, to simply write your own Torah or commission your own Torah costs a lot. Well, to write your own Torah would take a lot of time and a lot of skill. To commission the writing of a Torah takes a lot of money. You'd have to come up with, depends on the price, but between $15,000 and $25,000 to write a Torah. So most of us do not fulfill Ksiva Sefer Torah in that literal way. So the Rosh says, Rabbeinu Asher says, that the purpose of writing a Sefer Torah is to increase the resources for learning Torah, because people used to learn from a Torah before printing. The Torah was, they would learn from the Torah. So therefore the Rosh says, Bizman Hazer, where we have many, many Sfarim, this was before printing and certainly after printing, Kal V'chomer, you are Makayim, the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah, by buying Sfarim that you learn from. Let me underline, that you learn from, meaning it's not the passive buying of a Sefer, but it's buying a Sefer that you learn from. This is the Rosh, and the Shach, one of the greatest Achronim on the Shulchan Aruch, says we actually paskin like the Rosh. So it does turn out that Bizman Hazeh, you could be Makayim, the mitzvah of Ksiva Sefer Torah, by buying a Sefer that you learn from. Now, what Sefer? Any Sefer of the Torah. It doesn't have to be the Torah, meaning it could be a Mishnah, it could be a Gemara, it could be Masilas Yesharim. You buy a Sefer, and you learn from it. So that could be very cheap, right? $10, $5. You are Makayim, the mitzvah of Kesivas Sefer Torah, right? So that's the Rosh based on the Shach. Nevertheless, the poskim say that even if technically you have fulfilled it by buying a Sefer, you should try to have some connection to the actual writing of a Torah scroll. So the way that often works is that we do it by partnership. So for example, a shul or a yeshiva might sponsor the writing of a Torah scroll, and they sell off the letters. So they say, if you want to buy a letter, it'll be $25 a letter or whatever it is. If you want to buy your name, right? Your name is Moshe, your name is Yitzchak. So they'll charge more for that, etc. And that way, now, if you're actually yotzei that way, that's very problematical because you're essentially doing it as a partnership with everybody else. In other words, I'm buying the word Yitzchak in the Torah, but I'm not buying the other words. So essentially, the Torah is being written as a partnership for many, many people. So that is a machlokas. Am I yotzei ksiva Sefer Torah b'shutfus, when it's done in partnership with other people? So what we kind of do is we try to be yotzei different possibilities. Meaning, if I'm not able to write a Torah or commission a Torah, so I combine reliance on the rush by buying Sfarim, and I also am somech on the opinions that allow Kesiva Sefer Torah with partnership. So either one by itself might not be enough, but you're doing both of them. And in that way, you're closer to the probability of fulfilling the mitzvah. Now, I had mentioned that the mitzvah of Kesiva Sefer Torah is the 613th mitzvah according to the Rambam's count. But the Ramban, actually, he takes out an earlier mitzvah. That's another question. But the Ramban identifies a later commandment as the last mitzvah. And that's the mitzvah to recite blessings before the Torah. Birchos HaTorah is the oraisa. Where does the Torah say that? When Moshe Rabbeinu says, and we actually have this pasuk in Shemona Esrei before the Amidah, Ki Shem Hashem Ekra. So Moshe is saying, when I teach you the names of God, the Torah, Havu Gaidel Lelokeinu, you shall give greatness to God. The Ramban says that's a mitzvah taseh, to bless Hashem before you learn Torah. Not the nusach. The nusach is obviously, the actual text is a later thing. But there is a chiyuv d'oraisa. So the Ramban actually counts Birchas HaTorah as a mitzvah d'oraisa, ki Shem Hashem Ekra. The Rambam apparently does not count it as d'oraisa. Yeah.
How is that possible? In brachos, I think it's the sixth parak. Isn't there like a whole thing about how that bracha is d'oraisa?
Yeah, yes. So the whole question, the machlokas is based on the textual analysis of that sugya, whether there are certainly statements that it is the oraisa for sure. The question is whether those statements survive the maskana of a sugya. In other words, often when you analyze a shaklavataria that goes back and forth a lot, one of the things you need to ask yourself is whether certain statements that were made in the middle of the discussion remain valid at the end of the discussion. This is actually a very important key to advanced Gemara learning, and that is the Gemara does not always indicate whether a given statement was refuted or not. Sometimes you have to infer it from the give and take of the sugya, and there will be a big machlokas rishonim. Right, so this is where it comes. You are correct. There is a statement to that effect. The question is whether it survives the end of the discussion. Yeah.
Last month, I had asked the Rav, how is it that some people consider Purim to be the holiest day of the year when it's a holiday that we essentially made? And part of the answer that the Rav gave was that's the whole point, is that we can bring Kedusha into the world. So just over the break, I found myself wondering why or how can we bring Kedusha into the world? Why would Hashem allow us to bring Kedusha into the world?
Yeah. Well, it is quite an amazing thing, but that is part of the implication that we are made in the image of God. Now, the word tselem, which is translated as image, the Rambam writes that the Hebrew meaning of tselem is not the same as the English. In other words, when you see the word image, you automatically think of a physical image. Now, we're not made in the physical image of God because God does not have a physical image. So the Rambam explains that the notion of image of God does not refer to any visualization at all. It refers to spiritual characteristics of divinity, that our souls are sparks of God, our souls are breath of God. In fact, this is very significant. Everything in the universe was created by God's speech. God said, let there be this. Let there be cows. Let there be dogs. Let there be cats. We're not given all the let there be's, but implicitly, there was a let there be for everything. So a dog is created because God said, let there be dogs. The human soul was not created by God saying, let there be man. The human soul was created by God breathing into the dirt. Now that's very, very different. The Zohar says, when I breathe into you, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, I am pouring into you my life force. So I don't mean the human body. The human body is certainly a created entity. But the soul, at least the higher levels of the soul, that itself is be complicated. The soul is not a God didn't create the soul. The soul is God's breath. Right? God didn't create his breath either, right? God's breath is God. Hard to understand, very hard to, I don't pretend that I understand it either. But the soul is not a created entity. The soul is part of God's essence. So as a result, the implication of Tselem Elokim is that God has bestowed upon us divine powers because there is godliness within us, and among that is the ability to bring holiness into the world. That's exactly the idea of Tselem Elokim. Tselem Elokim. We are very, very, very powerful. You know, in the Talmud Devorah, the whole Sefer is about what we do opens up the channels of blessing that God wants to deliver to the world. We control it. We control the positives. We control the negatives. Okay, yeah.
For Ashkenazim, my question is, why do we maintain culturally Yiddish pronunciation of certain words and psukim when sometimes this negatively impacts our diktik and tefillah, sometimes more so than Sephardim, excuse me. For example, instead of saying like the word like ba'alim, we say bailim, like Shabbos instead of Shabbos. You know, like
Yeah,
sometimes we'll
yeah.
say, you know, by davar Hashem el Moshe Aleinu, and I see those. We'll say this, but it'll actually impact their tefillah. It'll struggle more. So why should we keep up this culture?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting thing. You know, obviously, when you say Shabbos is not Hebrew. And let me point out, there were at least two pronunciations of Hebrew. There actually were very, very more. I mean, there was, it's almost extinct now, but I learned Hebrew as a child from somebody who was very, very baldiktuk, but spoke Ashkenazi Hebrew. So he would say, Ani holech lebeis haKnesses biyom haShabbos. So there is Ashkenazi Hebrew grammatically correct. But the word Shabbos is not Hebrew at all. There is no Hebrew word called Shabbos. Shabbos is Yiddish. It happens to be Yiddish has taken a lot of Hebrew words and Yiddishized them. Okay? So if somebody says Shabbos Shalom, you may look at him as eccentric because it's extinct more or less, but he is speaking a legitimate Hebrew. If somebody says Shabbos Shalom, that is not Hebrew at all. That is, it's not even Yiddish, but whatever it is, it's and the like. So part of the problem is that because the Yiddish words are so similar to the Hebrew words, people figure they can use the Yiddish in place of the Hebrew, and that's absolutely wrong, absolutely wrong. The halacha is that when you daven, whether your pronunciation is Ashkenazi or Sephardi, whether you say Shabbos or whether you say Shabbat, and we can talk about that, should an Ashkenazi, okay. But I'm going with the assumption that your yotze either way with that. But you have to have the accent in the right way. You know, in most words in Hebrew, the accent is on the last syllable. That's called milra. In Yiddish, the accent happens to be on the first syllable, Shabbos, as opposed to Shabbos, right? So accent is important, pronunciation is important, vowels are important. So yeah, all I can tell you is that you have to be careful not to bring Yiddish pronunciation into tefillah, and that is true, I want to say, whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi. So Shabbos is perfectly fine, but Shabbos is not legitimate in davening or the like. Very, very, very important. Now, your question is, so why do we allow those old pronunciations to survive? I think there are still good reasons. I mean, for example, why in most yeshivas, Litvish yeshivas, and all Hasidic yeshivas, the language of instruction is still Yiddish. It's not English, certainly. It's not even Hebrew. It's Yiddish. Why is Yiddish still around, even? Like, why do we need Yiddish? Now, there are those who are anti-Yiddish. There are those who say, Yiddish has no justification today. We have Hebrew. Hebrew is the holy language. But Yiddish does connect you to a certain history. It connects you to 1,000 years of Gedolim. The Ramah spoke Yiddish. The Tosos Yom Tov spoke Yiddish. Rebbe Kiva Eger spoke Yiddish. The Chassam Sofer spoke Yiddish. I mean, this we kind of know. So there is a notion of holding on to it because it connects me to a culture of Kedusha, and it makes me feel that I'm a part of that world. So you can call that sentimentalism, but I think there is something to it. There's something to it. And so that's why we hold on to the Yiddish, but it is very important that you don't bring Yiddish into your tefillas. Now, did the average Yiddish-speaking Jew in Europe follow the diktik rules? Probably not, but certainly Gedolim did. I mean, people who were conversant with halacha were careful. So when the Vilna Gaon spoke in Yiddish, he said Shabbos. I can guarantee you, when he said davening, he said Shabbos. Okay, yeah.
Begs the question. I heard the story that the Hasidim did their diktuk, with the Yiddish way to fight against reform. That halachically, that's a problem.
It could very well be. In fact, there were a lot of things. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that went in the wrong direction because we were trying to fight the reform or the haskalah, the enlightenment. For example, the idea that for many, many years, we didn't learn Tanakh, we didn't learn Nach in yeshivas. Maybe Chumash, maybe did, but not Nach. Because Nach was taken over by the maskilim who didn't like Gemara, so they put all of their efforts in Nach. So as a result, if somebody saw you learning Nach, they suspected that you were not religious, really. And as a result, our own Tanakh, our own Nach at least, suffered by guilt by association. What do they say? They say, what do they say? They say the following. They say, the maskilim stole from us Nach and manners, derech eretz. And the Zionists stole from us love for Eretz Yisrael. And the Balei Tshuva stole from us tshuva. Meaning, there are certain ideas that every Jew should have. Every Jew should yearn to do tshuva. Every Jew should yearn to be connected to Eretz Yisrael. Every Jew should learn Nach. And every Jew should be a refined person of derech eretz. But what happens is, when these good things become identified with bad movements, they become treif. So I can't learn Nach because the maskilim took over Nach. I can't be a dignified, refined person because that also was a sign of the assimilation of the haskalah. So that's why I kind of have to be a messy, sloppy, inconsiderate litterer, because if I'm too meticulous about things like that, he's a maskil. The Zionists took away love of Israel. So if I love Israel, you're a Zionist, you probably say Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut. And the Baal Tshuva took over Tshuva. So now I can't do Tshuva because you're going to think I'm a Baal Tshuva, I'm an FFP and the like. So this unfortunately is a reality of life, that very, very positive ideas sometimes get hijacked, and then it's hard for us to reclaim them in the right way. Yeah.
Rabbi, continuing on what you just said about really the differences in many movements. I mean, going back thousands of years, we talked this morning about the Stukum and the Karaites.
Yeah.
Really, Moshiach and like the coming of Moshiach and the Jewish people, you see them today. You go a couple neighborhoods down, we're following, the Eastern European apparel. We got lip box, all the above. What does Hashem see about the Jewish people uniting? We're a small population.
Yeah. So that's so interesting. There's a beautiful vort from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. It says in Megillas Esther that Esther found favor in everybody's eyes. So the Gemara explains, everybody who looked at Queen Esther thought she was of their nation. So I'll use modern nations as an example. So if I was a Britisher, if I was in England, Esther, I knew she'd be British. France, Germany, American. Everybody saw in Esther that she's from my country. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky says, when Moshiach comes, it's going to be the same thing. Because Moshiach will embody all of the good qualities in each part of Am Yisrael. The Satmar will say, I knew he was Satmar. Chabad will say, I'm putting aside the particular controversies, he's Chabad. The Misnagdim will say, I'm my own Misnagdim. Because each of these movements has something positive, and I will be attuned to that. I will see that positivity through the lens of my soul. So here is the thing. You have to understand that the diversity that exists in the Jewish people is not a negative thing necessarily. It's different ways of serving Hashem. There are Hasidic drachim, different Hasidic drachim, different lirefuah ways. When we talk about unity, that doesn't have to mean conformity. That doesn't have to mean sameness. It doesn't have to mean, okay, we got to get rid of the distinct uniforms and everybody has to dress the same. It's the other way around. It's beautiful that each group or each neshama has its own path to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Where it gets bad is when you look down at the other groups and you denigrate them, you insult them, you demonize them, you delegitimate them. So when Moshiach comes, Baruch Hashem, we're not going to have that. But that doesn't mean, there won't be Ashkenazim, there won't be Sephardim, there won't be different Hasidic groups. Moshiach will appeal to everybody. He'll, when Moshiach will talk to Satmar, he'll give them some nice Satmar Torah. And then to Chabad and whatever it is. Because he will incorporate the good and the truth that's in all of these movements. So this is a big mistake. People sometimes think that unity means we're not going to have all of these different movements. The Medrash says very beautifully that if you look at a garden with different colored flowers is more beautiful than a garden with only one type of flower. Hashem wants there to be different types of flowers as long as they don't attack each other. So that's kind of how we understand it. Yeah.
Is it proper for a Ben Torah to chew bubblegum? And if one is chewing bubblegum, should they make a bracha on it?
Yes, let me answer the second question first. Do you make a bracha on gum? That is a huge machlokas on poskim. It is a big machlokas. Many poskim say that's something that you don't swallow, even though some sugar, whatever, gets into your saliva and you do swallow something, but you don't really swallow the actual substance. Many say you don't make a bracha. Because of this, it's actually halachically advisable that you take a sip of water before you eat you make a shakol on the water, have kavan on the gum, and then, of course, you can eat the gum without a bracha at that point because it's a suffix and the like. Now, should a Ben Torah chew gum? So I'm always a little loath to say something that I might be personally guilty of, because I don't want to impose higher standards than I myself keep. But yeah, there have been Rosh Yeshivas that have felt that chewing gum, at least in an open, ostentatious way. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky used to say it resembled a cow chewing its cud. He says was not a dignified behavior for a Ben Torah, at least in the street or at least publicly. Now again, if you're by yourself, I assume there's no particular big deal, but it's generally not so respectful in a base medrash. Now again, though, I would say, there's chewing and there's chewing. I can't necessarily say I have a precise standard, but a person could. Let's assume you have a sucking candy in your mouth. Let's take that. Now, that's not the same. You can suck a candy, but people don't, know that you're, they don't know that you're moving your mouth around so much. So if it's, low key, it's one thing. But if it's like a constant chewing, especially then you want to blow some bubbles, with it. It's not a dignified thing. Yeah.
Why is Nach considered part of the Written Torah if it wasn't written by Moshe at Har Sinai.
Yeah, the status of Nach, Nevi'im and Kesuvim is very problematical because God did not now, again, you have to understand that there are Gemaras that actually say that Nevi'im and Kesuvim were given to Moshe Sinai. There are Gemaras that say that, but it obviously doesn't mean that because obviously Yeshayahu was not given the script of what he was to say. So maybe the Gemara means Moshe knew ahead of time what would happen, but the Jewish people were not given Sefer Yeshayahu before Yeshayahu. I mean, that I think is a double pashut, ma'od. So what makes the Nevi'im the written Torah, presumably, is that although they are not a source of mitzvos, God did command that this be written down, meaning to say, when God gave a prophecy to a Navi, God didn't only give him a prophecy, but God also instructed him to write it down. So anything where God himself commanded you to write down is considered to be Torah shebichsav. See, it's the tzivui. Now, it is complicated. There's a lot of unanswered questions here. When a Navi gets a prophecy, and a Navi, let's first talk about it on two levels, because there are two levels here. A Navi gets a prophecy and is normally told to orally communicate it. So when the Navi is told, go to the people or go to the king and tell him, so, what does that mean? Did God give him the exact words? Did God say, here is your script? Or did God give him a general message through pictures and the like, and visions, and the Navi puts it into his own words? See, in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, God gave him the exact words. Right? God gave him the language. In the case of Nevi'im, some have said, even when the Navi says, Ko Amar Hashem, so says God, that's the Navi paraphrasing the vision. Like God gives you a vision, and you then describe your vision. So that's on the level of the oral. But then we ask ourselves, at some later point, God commanded the Navi to write it down. So at that level, you can raise the same question. Even if God didn't give him the script in the oral delivery, did he give him the script in the writing, or did he just say, write down your description of the nevuah that I gave you? Meaning, clearly there are two stages in nevuah. There's the vision to communicate it orally, and then there's the command to write. But in both of those steps, we're not really clear if the script was dictated by God. Now, what is the difference between Nevi'im and Ketuvim? I think the difference is exactly this. Kesuvim, there was never a commandment to give it orally. That's why it's called Kesuvim. There was a commandment to write it down. So the book of Daniel, God told him, write down these words. But God never told Daniel, communicate these words. But it's a little bit elusive. Mr. Hashem, when we reviewed Nach, maybe we'll go over it in a bit more detail. But it's not a simple thing, yeah.
I'm Sephardi, and I remember one time asking if I'm davening with an Ashkenazi minyan, what parts that I should follow the minyan, what parts I should do my own thing.
Yeah.
And Rebbe said that anything out loud you shouldn't differentiate from, because then it's going to cause confusion. And so we're at the time of the Sefirah, and Sephardim say Aleinu first, and then do the Sefirah. And Ashkenazim do Sefirah first, and then Aleinu. Should I do Sefirah with the minyan, and then say Aleinu afterwards, or should I just say Aleinu first quietly, and then do Sefirah by myself afterwards?
Yeah. So I would differentiate. I think the stuff that you say after the Shemona Esrei, there's much less concern, because everyone does their own thing after Shemona Esrei. So I don't think you have to worry about changing the sequence of Aleinu and Sefirah. The primary concern was for Kedusha, for Kaddish, and the like. But I wouldn't worry so much about the post-Shemona Esrei things. That's going to be okay. Okay, thank you very much. Be well and have a good week.